beg your pardon. Yeah, this is the when I hit the down arrow, it just skipped the last slide. So now we're going to talk about the concept. Okay, so the concept, we're just going to begin with the supposition that the various concepts that we're talking about straight away enjoy internal relationships relative to one another, but internal relationships which don't, as it were, cause them to coalesce and collapse into mere unity, the mere unity of a something. Then we'd be back in the sphere of being. So you can do this if you think about things functionally, when things work. So we're back to Plato's Republic now. Everyone mind your own business. That means keep your mind on your work. So now in the sphere of the concept, we're thinking about things each having a function that it performs vis-a-vis other things, okay? So let's see here. Here, each particular element is functionally integrated into a system of particular elements, the whole of which unites particularity, right? Each particular element in the community of elements doing its work. This unites particularity with universality, the whole context taken immediately, so as far as you think of it as a whole, so as to produce singularity, that is the unity of co-functional particulars within the universal system of their relations. That's the basic idea. So you begin by thinking about maybe a city, okay? And the city has different functions. You have a mayor, and you have a chief of police, and a fire chief, and a chief fiscal officer, right? And if you have a city library, then a chief librarian. And each person performs, and in an ancient city, you have a high priest. And even today, you know, the bishop is pretty important in his city. He's not a government official, but if you look at how things actually, how the sausages are made, you see there's very intensive cooperation between Catholic bishops and cities and states and even the federal government. They get a lot of money from them, and they organize educational programs for persons working on English as a second language and various other things. Of course, they can't, if they get it from the government, they can't use that money for their particular Catholic goals, but they can organize things the government is interested in them helping do. Let's put it that way. Okay, so we have a city. You have all these particular offices, each one doing his work. Okay, so we began with universality. We started with the city, and then we focused in on each office at a time, and now we want to unite those offices and understand their cooperation with one another, how they interact with one another, and that is the concept of singularity. You get that? Okay. So here we encounter what might be called a logic of science. Hegel has a kind of logic of science for us. And yeah, you know, there are very few people who work on Hegel's logic of science, but those who do have said some very interesting things. So Hegel contends that mechanism, so the idea of a mechanism, and a lot of modern science is dedicated to discovering and articulating mechanisms, chemical concepts and chemical transformations, and biological concepts all exhibit the logic of the concept, that there is a kind of, maybe it's a bit of a stretch, maybe he's forcing things a bit, particularly with mechanism, right? But with a chemical interaction, maybe just possibly we can see that there's some kind of quasi-functional relationship between methane and carbon and hydrogen united in exactly the right way so as to generate this thing that we call methane with its novel qualities, right? Isn't chemistry rather amazing? You can take things and combine them, and you end up with something new. It's like magic, practically. And of course, chemistry did emerge from alchemy. Alchemy was the effort to more or less put things through a certain process so you could generate gold. Why can't we generate gold? It seems like it shouldn't be that tough. I'm sure we can generate gold. Just the process would be so expensive, as they say, that it wouldn't profit us to do so, right? Okay, or that we can generate it and then drive the price of gold up, but they're not going to do that. So here we go. The ultimate level of the concept is that of the absolute idea at which thinking grasps the necessary relations that preceded this moment and its own thinking of these relations. Okay, so the absolute idea grasps everything that's been thought this far, but that grasping of that set of relations up to this moment is its thinking of its relationship to these relations, and that is the generation of the act of divine self-consciousness. Okay, so when this maybe Hegel's right. Maybe he's describing not God in himself, but he's describing um, some kind of self-conscious entity that has to exist if we're going to succeed in thinking about anything at all. I'm willing to entertain that conclusion. I do think he's made a couple of discoveries, so why not go that far, at least as far as entertaining the possibility of it? So this thing would, this act of thinking, this disembodied act of thinking, would propel itself along and finally arrive at the point where it has set all these categories in relationship to one another, and thus be propelled or compelled logically with absolute necessity at the end to think itself at the very end of this whole thing. It has to ultimately think of the concept of truth, and therefore something grasping truth as such. And to think of something grasping truth is to think thinking, and that would be it. That would be where you get closure. So this dialectical process of thought, in which form and content are united, and each category in and of itself, by itself, extends itself into further categories, right? As it were, through meaning or intending to think or grasp a category in a certain way, or a pair of categories in a certain way, and being compelled to think about them in a different way in virtue of its own inner failure, right? And then finally getting to the concept of truth. And if you're talking about judgments and syllogisms, then and scientific theory, so on and so forth, you're in the native domain of truth. Okay, all these things point towards and presuppose the concept of truth. If you're there, you are right there with the concept of that which grasps truth, that is something which thinks. And so at this stage of the logic, we arrive at the concept of pure thought thinking itself. And my friends, that is Aristotle's definition of God. All right. This is Hegel, the Aristotelian. There's a philosopher who was he's my intellectual grandfather, because he was the mentor of Kenley Dove, who passed away recently, unfortunately, who studied with him. So my grandfather, as it were, was Wilfrid Sellars. And he said that Hegel is the Aristotle of the modern world. Okay? Okay. So that's the logical circle of totality. But Hegel doesn't stop there. So logical totality, he says, must release itself. Entschließen is the German, if you care. Logical totality must release itself into nature, not create nature. So this is not a strict Christian doctrine. It has to release. So remember that he said that Christianity is basically true, but at the level of symbolism, and you have to overcome it with his system. Not a very humble man, this guy Hegel, by the way. I think he even said that I myself am God. What he meant, if he said something like that, it was pretty close to that. What he meant by that is that I have united my thought with the thought of God in his thinking of the pure categories. So yeah, so that's a little bit extreme, and I think we can demonstrate it's false. Actually, if anything, he's united himself with an activity of pure categorical thinking. That's not God, though. So let's look at this. So logical totality has to release itself into nature. Well, how does that happen? I've done a lot of reading in this area, actually, and no one's ever explained how this happens. But let's just grant that it can happen for the sake of argument. Nature must be overcome and actualized in spirit. Spirit is the sphere of human existence in which we rise from, as we're atomized individuals through acts of mutual recognition, into cultures and societies, and eventually through a series of world civilizations, Chinese, Indian, Mesoamerican, and the like, eventually to European, and then finally to modern European, which he thinks is the be-all, end-all, which is why Hegel has been accused of being Eurocentric. I once attended a talk where the guy asked the question, is Hegel Eurocentric? And he opened up by saying that's like asking, is the Pope Catholic? By the way, there are people today asking if the Pope is Catholic, because he's said some things which are on the surface of it in contradiction of the Catholic magisterium. But back then, there was no question. I think it was John Paul II. So, is the Pope Catholic? Yeah, of course he's Catholic. Is Hegel Eurocentric? The answer to that question, my friends, is yes. He's definitely Eurocentric, but he thinks he has a logic which shows why European civilization is the highest accomplishment. Modern European civilization is the highest accomplishment historically of all civilizations. Now, you guys may have gathered from various things I've said here or there that I don't agree with that. Okay. There are wonderful things, very wonderful things. Very wonderful things we've achieved the last 200 years. But as far as the entire modern project, particularly, Hegel didn't grasp the modern project actually, but the modern project as the attempt at more or less establishing ourselves as masters and possessors of nature, which Hegel never got. Um, I think that's ultimately destructive and is leading to the potential extinguishing of our species. So one has to call it what it is and try to stop it from being implemented, because the project now, and I'm not making this stuff up, just pick up the literature on it published by the people who are attempting to do it. Just look at what Elon Musk is doing, right? With his attempt at inducing as many people as possible to put a chip in their heads and selling everybody a robot. You're like, oh, what's the big deal? I'll have a chip in my head. I'll be able to download the Encyclopedia Britannica. It'd be nice to have Rosie the robot around doing my dishes and things of that sort and whatnot. Well, the way theorists in this area are talking, particularly associated with this group called the World Economic Forum, and this is some people say, well, that's conspiracy theory. It's not a theory because it's all right there on their website, and they publish books, and you can look at their conferences. So it's all out in the open. What they intend to do, look at Yuval Harari, Harari. He says that the human being is now a hackable animal. Freedom doesn't exist, and we need to now move into a stage in which human beings are integrated into an information network. So that we need what you call an internet of bodies and an internet of things, so that what you're doing is always tracked effectively. You will have a kind of, this is for the sake of discussion, speak metaphorically now, you'll have your own QR code, maybe literally, I don't know. But you'll have something that'll mark you, right? And you'll be something in a node. You'll be a node actually in a system of relations, system of nodes, and the various versions of this. Some suggest, that your biometric or certain elements of your biometric data can be spontaneously and continuously transmitted into some AI mainframe. And then the scary part, as they suggest, is that it can send out signals that modify your behavior, which doesn't sound too appealing to me. So, so do I think there are people who are trying to implement something like that? 100%, because I've looked at their videos and read a little bit online about what they actually say. So I've heard their own words. Again, that Harari guy talks about this, and he's like the court philosopher for the World Economic Forum. So just have a look at that stuff yourself. Don't believe it because I said it. Form your own judgment. I'm not going to insist. And for that reason, I think we're witnessing the winding down and the self-transformation of modernity into a system of totalitarian system of globalist technocracy, dominated by an elite. Now, this actually was predicted effectively, not in these terms that I'm using, but predicted in a book called The Abolition of Man. Maybe I should have ended the course with that. By C.S. Lewis of Narnia fame, right? He wrote the children's books, and he wrote a lot of literary criticism, and then he wrote some popularity. So the abolition of man is, what is that? That's sort of an analysis of the spiritual condition of the age written in the 40s, and he said this thing's inevitable. We're moving at an extremely fast and relentless pace towards concentrating unimaginable concentrations, an unimaginable magnitude of technological power in the hands of a very small number of people. And then we have to trust them to be angels, or at least virtuous, in order for them to use that power responsibly. And he said the chance of that happening is basically zero, because once persons have that power and they see and experience the power of manipulating people and controlling how they think and how they behave, inevitably they come to think of themselves as gods and treat everyone else as if either they were mere animals or not even human. And that reduces the rest of the species to their mere plaything. And that's what we're witnessing right now. Okay? So Hegel didn't get that right. Missed the whole thing, actually. Nonetheless, his social and political philosophy, and I published on it, I know it extremely well. It's quite profound. I can recommend you look at it. good. I like talking philosophy. I could just keep this course going forever. Just recording lectures, and I'd rather see you face to face, have discussions. This whole kind of idea of just sitting here reading, talking into this microphone, never meeting anybody, is strikes me as rather preposterous. This is not the ideal. Very far from ideal. Hopefully, you're learning something this way, and when you do your next course in philosophy, you can do a face-to-face version if your schedule will permit that. Anyway, we have one more lecture on Hegel coming. We'll do that tomorrow. Okay, so have a good night. Think about what we talked about. Send me some questions if you have them. Now, if you're working on your paper, send me a paragraph with your topic, not your topic, your thesis statement in that paragraph. Show me what you're thinking so I can then look at that and help you formulate a really nice thesis statement. Once you have that down, typically the rest of the paper writes itself. Okay, I've been doing this for decades. That always is the key. Be well.